This movie follows on from the previous one where we set up a basic MVC web application. So here's where we got to. We were adding in a array into our courses controller in home controller. We'd hard coded in this information. We had also moved our own static files across into www.root. That would help style up the pages. It's got a style sheet there, and we had our courses view, which was looping around that data from that list to output it to the page. Let's just reload IIS, Internet Information Services, and you can see this running. So we had running off localhost here, we had this home page, we had another sample static page there, these both in www.root, just standard HTML pages, but this dynamic page here was using the controllers. You'll see it's going to home courses, so that's calling the home controller to call the courses view, and it's loading that data in there from that list. So where we're going to go with this now is that we're going to properly flesh out this with a model. So the model is the business logic side of the model view controller paradigm. So we looked at controllers and views last time. What we were missing from the MVC was the proper use of a model. So that's what we're going to do in this tutorial. So there is a guide to help you along with this. It's this URL here, which will be in the notes below. The previous guide is hyperlinked in there as well if you need that. And we also have a GitHub here, which has got a completed example of the notes in there. I'm just going to add this into Edge as well, and then I can keep that live as I jump between the local host. Right, so here we go. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we are going to use something called Entity Framework. Now, Entity Framework is going to make dealing with the database a little bit easier. It's going to help us create a database in a fairly seamless way. There is a little bit of initial setup here, but once the setup is done, it's done, and we get access to the Entity Framework. Now, Entity Framework is an ORM, that's an Object Relational Mapping. It's an open source project, but it is supported by Microsoft. And the idea is that we can take .NET objects and map them to our back-end database in such a way to ease our communication with the database and the transactions with the database, so that our CRUDing, our creating, reading, updating and deleting operations become a bit more seamless and easier to implement. Now, because Entity Framework is an open source project, it's not built in by default into Visual Studio, so that means that we're going to need to extend it a little bit, and we're going to extend it using something called packages. So packages are third-party bundles of code, of useful code that we can access, and we can bring them down and load them and import them into our application. So this is commonly done in other languages. So in Node.js, for example, we have something called NPM, Node Package Manager. Ruby has gems, PHP has something called Composer, and Microsoft manages this package process through something called NuGet, NuGet, and that provides a standardized way to create, host, consume, and provide these packages. So that is built into Visual Studio. So what first thing we need to do is to access that to download the necessary packages. And the packages that we need are these three here. So we need Microsoft Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework SQL Server, and Entity Framework Tools. So let's show you how we can do that. So I'll close down the files that were there from last time, because we're not going to be doing any file editing for a minute. And what we're going to do is going to go up to Tools, and select NuGet Packet Manager, and then pick Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. We get into there, and we've got currently none installed, but if I go to Browse, in there I will then be able to browse for these. I'll have to do it individually, so I'll just copy that from the guide into here. And there's the one, Microsoft Entity Framework Core, 163 million downloads. So that's the one we want. We'll install that into the project. And let's install it. Pop up with a message. Are we happy with that? Yes, we are. And we'll accept. So that has loaded in. And then the next one is SQL Server. So Entity Framework SQL Server. So I'll go back and I'll do another search for that. And there it is. So 95.7 million downloads for that one. So Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Again, I'll install it in and accept the messages that come up. And then the final one of these three is Tools. So Entity Framework Core Tools. So let's add that one in here as well. So I'll search for that. 73 million. Install that. And OK. Right. So now if I go to Installed, it should tell me which ones I've got installed. You need to clear the search messages out. It confuses me, but there are the free Entity Framework packages that I've now got access to. Okay, so just check that that matches what's in the guide there. You've got these three loaded, and then we can move on to the next step, which is where we're going to create a model that the Entity Framework can then reference. So we've finished in there. We can close that down, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a class in the models folder. When we created this MVC application in the last movie, it created an error default file in there, but we haven't got anything else in models. So what we're going to do is right click and add in a class, and this I'm going to call course. So that's singular course with a capital C and .cs C# file extension, and it adds in this empty class file for me. So this is going to represent an entity. So an entity, if you can think of as being like a row in your database. So we're going to have a database of courses that this model is going to outline what a course would consist of. So notice that the namespace is correctly matching the name of my project. Now in the guide, I've got the code snippet there. So if you do copy these from here, just do make sure you change the namespace. These are the lines that I need to add in now to my model. So I'm going to just copy those across. So they go inside of here. And I'll talk you through these. So first of all, we've got the ID at the top there. So this is a public integer that I've called ID, and we've got a get and set against it, so I'll be able to get its value and set its value. Above there, we've got this what's known as an attribute of key, and that's indicating to the model that we want this to be our primary key. Now you'll notice that you get a squiggly line in Visual Studio. That's because we do need to import in, if we click on the light bulb, we do need to import in the component model data annotations. So we're going to be using to import it. So we'll select that. That will fix that issue. And it's added that in the top there now. So what we're defining there is that every course will have a primary key, which will be an integer called ID. We're also indicating that every course will have a course name. That will be a string. And that every course will have a course level, and again that will be a string. Now we can revisit this later on to change that, but for now I can just save that file and close that away. So we now have a model in place. Next up, point 4 in the guide is that we're going to create what's known as a connection string. Now, connection strings are not unique to .NET Core. They're used in lots of other web database technologies. And the idea is that the string, the text, provides all the information required in order to find and locate the database that your application is using. Now, in the case of our application, our connection string is going to look like so. So that's indicating that we're going to use a SQL database, and I'm giving the database a name, and we are using a trusted connection that can have multiple active result sets. So that's the connection string that we need to use. Where that goes though is we're going to place that in a file called appsettings.json. You'll find that in the root of your application. It's a JSON file, which is a JavaScript object notation file. It's a standardized data file that we use all the time on the web. If you've been looking at Twitter or Facebook today, you've been consuming files in this format, and it's particularly useful for kind of putting setting information in. So if you look at app settings, you'll find that in the root. It's already got some default settings in, and what we want to do is add in our connection string. So we're going to add in connection strings because we might have multiple ones later. So we're going to add in connection strings, and inside of that there's going to be a name of default connection, and then inside of that is the actual value of our query, our connection string. So I'm going to copy that. So notice I'm grabbing the comma up there as well, and that's going to go in just there. Right, so I'll save that. Again, these files are all available on GitHub if you're worried that you're not setting them up correctly. Now we will make reference to that default connection in one of the other steps as we work our way towards being able to build the database. Now, core to Entity Framework is something called a context. So it has something called a database context class. This is a class that represents the session with the database and provides a series of methods or APIs of working with the database. So this is the real key to manipulating and working with our database. So we need to create a context. So as we created the model in the model for the course, we're going to create our application. We're going to create a database context inside of that models folder, and I'm choosing to call it application DB context. So inside the models, let's create ourselves another class file inside of there, and I'm going to call this application DB context. So notice it's got capital A, capital D, capital B, C, and it's a CS file. So that should create the skeleton of the class. Again, just make sure it's in the correct namespace, and there's our name of it. So what we're going to add in is we're going to add this. That gives us the bare bones of the class, but what we need to indicate is that this is going to be of type DB context. So that needs adding in here. And we also need to then indicate that, well, we then need to build what's known as a constructor, which is this here. This is a constructor method that has the same name as the class, and it's going to receive the options, a set of options for then setting up a database connection. Lots of squiggly lines, but we'll fix these in a second. And then we're going to also declare a database set method that is going to be a set of database results based on our course model, and we'll call it courses. And that is how we're going to be able to access our database. So we'll add that in as well under here. Now, so we've got lots of squiggly lines that obviously mean there's an issue, and that's primarily because what we haven't done is, because this is an entity framework feature, we need to make sure that we're using Microsoft Entity Framework, that package that we downloaded. So if I add that in, it should fix everything up for me there. Right, great. So I'll save that. Again, there's a copy here and there's a copy on GitHub if you're worried you've not got that set up correctly. So we're getting there, a few more steps, one more editing of code before we can create our database. So the next thing is we need to configure our startup file, which is here. So this file is triggered at startup and it's got various configuration pieces of information in it. And this method here, configure services, we can use this to configure all the services that are used by our application. This, for example, is controlling, is setting up the views and the controllers. So underneath that line on line 25, what we're going to do is we're going to add in the application. We're going to add a DB context to our services. It's going to be the DB context that we created in application DB context, and the options are going to be our default connection. So I'm going to copy that, and that's going to go in underneath here. Now again, there's going to be issues here because it doesn't understand what application DB context is. If up here, that's because we've not loaded in the model and also entity framework. So if we resolve these issues one by one, you'll see that when I click on this, it gives me suggested solutions under the light bulb, and it's saying you need to use models. So let's import the models. That will fix that. It now knows what that is. And then down here, this is entity framework again. Use entity framework, import entity framework. Yes, please. Fixes that. So those two are now added in my imports, my using statements at the top. So we save that, and that is the last of the code changes we need to make. We've now got everything lined up such that we can do what's known as migrate and build our database. Now this is done through a command line tool called Package Management Console. We can access this through Tools, Nugget Packet Manager Console, and I'll open up this console down here at the bottom. So the first command I'm going to run is add migration initial. This will create what's known as a migration file in order to set up my database, which we then run with the update database command. Now I'm just going to make a slight change here that you don't need to do on your example, but I've already got a database called My Courses, so I'm just going to call this My Courses demo 1, just in case I've got another one called that. So you don't need to worry about that. You can leave that as is. And so let's go back down to the console here, and I'll add in add dash migration initial. Fire that up, and fingers crossed it will say build started. It'll hopefully say build done or build succeeded, and then we are done. Okay, so you'll see it's jumped into this file at the top here, so it's created this migrations folder, and inside of there, here is the C# that we could have written ourselves to create the table, to assign the columns, to assign the primary key. So, but it created that for us from that model file, so we didn't need to worry about creating that code. All we needed to do was create the model, and then the entity frameworks generated that for us. So that's the benefit of the entity framework. Now with that in place, we can then run the second of those two commands, which is update database, and away it should go, build started, and hopefully we get a done. Great, so that all looks good. So I've just run these two commands one after the other. So the next thing to do is go and find where our data is. So where is it? I'll try and just stay within Visual Studio Code here. You can use other tools outside of Visual Studio Code, but if I just want to keep it all internal, I could go to View, SQL Server Object Explorer, and then inside of there you can see a SQL Server up at the top. If I expand that open, this one here is my server. That was what we put in the query string. If I go to databases, see I've got lots of other ones there, but there's the one that I've just created. If you don't see that, then click on the Add SQL Server button, go to Local, pick up your local database from there, and then connect, and you should then see it in the list. Now if I peel that open, that's my database, and if I go to my tables, there's my courses table that I've just created, and I can right click on that and view data, and there's the data. So we haven't put any data in there yet, but you see there is the table structure that we asked it to create for us. So let me put, you can just add courses in, so let me put in design, I'll say that's a BA, put in software engineering, and I'll say that's a BEng. Okay, so we've got a bit of data in there. Let's click down here to assign that. So now what I want to use, I'll just close that down for now, and now and this as well, and I want to add that data into my application. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we revisit, so the instructions in the guide there just talk you through what I've just done in terms of adding the data, so you've got a guide there to help you as well. And in order to see the data then in our page, we need to manipulate the controller to speak to the model and then update the view. So in your controllers, you've got home controller that's controlling everything in the home folder as they come in on that route. If I scroll down, this is where I mentioned earlier we'd hard coded these values in when we did this last time. So we're going to change that because we're going to use the database here instead. So in order to do that, first thing I'll need to do is just copy this declaration of a private read-only application DB context variable, and that's going to go in up here inside of my home controller. So it's going underneath something that was already there called logger. Just check your models have been loaded, which they are, which is good. So then this application DB context is going to get what's known as injected into this application. So the constructor home controller here needs to receive a second parameter, which is that there, and that second parameter then can be assigned to down here. We can then assign that to our variable that we declared of context, and we can set that in to be our context that gets injected into this application. It's been overly helpful there. What I want is that. Okay, so I've got an extra bracket there that's messing it up. There we go, that's fixed it. Right, so I've now got the context, this thing here available to me that represents our DB context. So down here in courses, rather than doing all of that, let me delete this, because what I can now do is just reference the database, which I could do with this. So I could say, okay, can you create a model from the DB context, from the courses that was defined inside of the DB set, and can you run toList, which will give me a list of all of the matches in that table. And then this model I can then pass to the view. So we can put the model in there like so. So again, the code there is in the guide. So that's passing our model, which is the results of this query. That's basically like an SQL select statement, passing it through to the view. So let's just amend the view. So I'll go to the view and say last time we had this set up using a hard coded in list, but now we're just going to have it reference model. So in there, I'll just change that to model. Now it will give me an interesting opportunity to test it at this point. So just save what I've got. Let's fire up the server. So off it goes. So our static pages are still hopefully working merrily there, and I'll go to the dynamic page. If it's all worked, we'll get a strange kind of item logic appear. There we go. So there's our courses. Now, it's say my college website models.course. That's because what I did here, if I just stop it for a second, is in the view, I just asked it to output the item. And the item represents a model. So let's just make this a little bit more readable. You can call this anything you like, but it is a course. Let me change it to a course. And then I could type course down here. And then I could use .syntax to access the values of that. So we had course name, if I remember rightly. Let's look back on here. What did I call it? Yes, so we had course name. So the @ sign is calling some C#, so go into the course, which is a result of that loop, which is looping the model, and extract the course name. So let's fire this up. So we'll go to dynamic page. And this time it should give me the course name. There you go, there's the design and software engineering. So let me go back to here now. If I went to my courses, so I viewed the data because this is dynamic now. We could then add another course in, a couple of other courses in there. And if I then go back to my browser and refresh, because this is dynamic, it should go and retrieve that information, which it does. So we've now truly got a model in place that we can, the data that we can use, and it's the controller that's passing it through to the view. Let's show you a couple of other tricks. If I go to the courses, we could now structure this a little bit differently. So maybe I'll put a row at the top and use table headers. So let's say table header. We have course name. Let's have another one of the other data that we had in there was course type, I think, wasn't it? Oh, course level, sorry, so course level. And then down here, if I copy that, so this is going to be repeated for every row. So let's make that course level down here. Right, so just save that, fire it up. So just give me a slightly different appearing table, but I'm using more data now out of the model than I was previously. So this time I should get the headers along the top, which is the THs. And then for each row of data, there you go, we've got the course information. Okay, other things we can do. The beauty of our backend database is it's super flexible. Let me just close that down. So what if I realized that actually I did want a little bit more data in there in terms of another field? Well, Entity Framework will help us out there. So if I go back to the model, remember this is where we defined the fields, if you like, within our table. So let me create another public string in here I'll call DPT for department, and let's say get set in there. So I'll save that. So I've changed the model. So what do I need to do here then is I need to set up a migration and then update my database. So if I go to Tools, NuGet Packet Manager, Console. So let me add a migration. So I'll call this add department field. Hit return. It's seeing if it can build that. It seems to be happy with that. So, and there you go, it's created the migration, which has now got the name of department in as a column. And then I run the update database command. And off it should go. And it's saying that that was successful. Right, so let's see if this has updated it. If I go to my view, SQL Server Object Explorer, there's my courses. Let's right click and view the data. And it's not showing that there. Let me just close that down. Maybe just need to refresh. Sometimes it takes a while for this to filter through. So there's my table again. Demo 1, let's view data. Aha, now we've got departments. So we could have humanities in there. And that one will be humanities, and that one would, and that will be science, say. Okay, so we've got some new data in. Let's amend the view to facilitate that. So if I want to choose that data now, I could put an extra header in here. Let's call it department. And down here, I'll put in a TD. And we'll say we'll say at course dot department. So let's save that. I'm being a little bit pedantic. I just want to get the table laying out a little bit better. So let's say that the THs and the TDs have a little bit of extra padding. So padding 5 pixels. Right, great. So let's fire that up. And off it goes. And hopefully now, there's our static pages still working. And if we click on the dynamic page, which is truly dynamic, it's going off to the database, retrieving some data, and building it into the page using C#. And there we go, there's our data. Still not happy with it picking up the CSS, so let me just cache bust it. So right click inspect, right click and cache and hard reload, and there's the now padding to lay that data out. Okay, great. So hopefully that's good, giving you an insight into how this technology works, and you can see the benefits of having a database driven website, a truly dynamic website with a model, view and controller. Thank you.